Good morning. I would wager that you probably were not expecting that in your English class you would be reading an excerpt from Dwayne Johnson's autobiography as you're working on your first assignment for the class. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about this essay and how it might help you as you think about the first paper that you're working on. This comes from his autobiography. This is from the time when he was still known as The Rock and not as Dwayne Johnson, movie star. This is when he was a professional wrestler. And I do have to admit that when I was a kid, when I was about 9 or 10 years old, I talked my mother into taking me and my sister to go see professional wrestling. It was called the World Wrestling Federation at that point. I think it's called something different now. And we went to see them up at the Springfield Civic Center in Springfield, Massachusetts, and we got to see people like Hulk Hogan and Rocky Johnson. Dwayne Johnson's father was probably there. It's so long ago, I don't remember all the other stars there. I have a vivid memory of seeing Hulk Hogan and probably Roddy Piper and some of those other figures from the late 70s and early 80s at this performance, at this World Wrestling Federation performance. My mother to this day still talks about it as being one of the strangest experiences that she ever had. She didn't even like going to see the circus when she was a little kid, let alone going to see wrestling. But she was a good sport. My dad, of course, was very happy to be part of that little trip to the Springfield Civic Center. So I got to see all this sort of World Wrestling Federation live and in person. So I will admit that I do have a fondness for some of this stuff, even though I haven't watched it in years and years. But I'm not assigning this because of any nostalgia that I have for the World Wrestling Federation of my youth. One of the reasons I like to assign this as you're working on the first paper for the class is that I think it fits in really well with the Mike Rose essay and also the Toni Morrison. And let me explain that here for a second. Then I'm going to mention a couple of sections of this essay that will be useful as you're thinking about and finishing this first paper. And also I'm going to talk a little bit about how this will tie in with the second paper that we do. So the readings and the assignments that we do over the course of the semester, you're going to find do fit in together. So they build on each other, not only in terms of your writing skills, but also in terms of the content of the material that I'm giving you. So one of the reasons that I like to do this one is that if you look at page 7 of this reading from Dwayne Johnson's autobiography, and again, this was published before he became a big movie star. This is when he still was at the height of his career as a wrestler. So at the top of page 7, and I have a printout here of the reading, he has a section where he talks about his life in this particular profession, or the life of his family in this profession. So here's what he says at the top of page 7. Wrestling is in my blood. I'm a third-generation worker and part of one of the most famous wrestling families in the business. Interestingly enough, though, it was wrestling that nearly tore my family apart. And I like that phrase that he uses, that not only is wrestling in his blood, but that he's a third-generation worker. So I look at this essay, or this collection of excerpts from his autobiography, as being sort of another supplementary reading to the Rose and to the Morrison. And if we backtrack a little bit, and if you think about one of the quiz questions from last week, the Mike Rose reading is essentially a cognitive biography. Okay, and a cognitive biography, if you remember from reading that essay, is basically a narrative or a story that tells about another worker's set of skills. So in the case of Mike Rose, he spends the bulk of that essay, as I've mentioned in previous videos, talking about his mother, Rosie, and then his Uncle Joe, and the skills that they needed to develop in those blue-collar jobs in order to be as successful as possible. And if you remember the main idea of Mike Rose's essay, his argument is essentially that any type of work involves intellectual and physical labor, and that any work that we think of as being too simplistic or not as worthy as another form of work is simply false. In his opinion, in a democratic society, all of these different types of labor deserve equal respect. They may be different forms of labor, but all of them are part of what makes the fabric of our society strong when we respect the work that others do and those that do that work. Now, when you look at Toni Morrison, I would call that a cognitive autobiography. And I call it a cognitive autobiography based on Rose's idea because she's telling a story about herself. She's telling a story about that first time that she had a job with that woman in town who I think was taking advantage of her. She's making this little girl move around these bookshelves, and at one point, you remember, she's trying to make her move a piano across the living room. That's not something a little kid should be doing. But that woman, excuse me, asks her to do that work, and then finally Toni Morrison gets home, and her father gives her all of that advice on how to put her family first, how to make that a priority. So that's basically a cognitive autobiography, a story about her experience as a worker and how she developed certain skills, in her case, through the advice of her dad, how that experience as a little girl influenced a lot of what she did later in her life as a writer. Now, this third piece, and the last of the readings that are connecting with the first paper, is sort of a fusion of those two things, right? Because he talks about his grandfather and he talks about his father, Rocky Johnson, and the kind of work that they had to do to be successful in the wrestling business, particularly early on in the 50s, 60s, into the 1970s, into the early 80s even, when I saw some of these performers when I was a little kid. But he's also talking to you about how he himself got into the business. So for those of you that might be writing about a family business that you've been part of, this might be one to take a look at as a model. Obviously, your essay is not going to be as long as these excerpts are, but what he does here, I think, really effectively is he shows you the tensions that can arise when there is a family business, and when you are trying to decide whether you want to become a part of that. And as far as he's concerned, as he says, he's a third generation worker. He's going to take on the mantle from his grandfather and from his father, and then make it a part of his life. Now, he doesn't do it very well. If you've read this already and you've gotten to the last part, you know that he gets in a little bit of trouble in middle school. For those of you that haven't had a chance to read this yet, I don't want to give too much away, but you'll see his kind of halting attempts to make himself part of this world of work that he sees through his father and through his grandfather and through his mother. His mother also is part of this world, supportive of his father. Her father, of course, also is part of the wrestling world, and there are stories about him in this narrative that really give you a full sense of why Dwayne Johnson decided to pursue this area and decided not to become, for example, a professional football player, which he talks about in the rest of the book, if you ever get a chance to read it, or if you know more about him and his background. And his father, if you remember, if you've read it about him or seen interviews with him, wasn't necessarily very pleased with the fact that he decided he also wanted to go into wrestling. His father wanted him to go to college, become perhaps a professional football player, professional athlete, and not a wrestler, but that's not what Johnson decided to do. And of course, he used his popularity as a wrestler to go into Hollywood and to become an actor and a producer, and all the other sort of work that he does today. So this is sort of a combination. It has elements of a biography because he's talking about his grandfather and about his father and about his mother, but then it also has elements of the autobiography that we saw in Toni Morrison, which is his story. How did he decide to become part of this family business, essentially? So as you're thinking about your paper and as you're working on it, this is a good essay also to look at, because you might find elements of his descriptions, of the way he talks about his family members, that you can find inspiration from as you are working on your essay. And as I've said before, if you would like me to read a draft, please send it along and I'll be happy to take a look at it. Now, one other thing I want to mention as you're reading through this and as you're thinking about it is that there are a lot of photographs in this. There are a lot of family photographs, and that's the second reason that I like to use this piece at the very beginning of the semester. So for example, we get these photographs of his grandfather, right? We get photographs also, which are kind of cute, I guess, of him and his grandparents, for example. It's hard to see it on this printout that I have. But all of these family photos are woven in. Now, you don't have to think too much about that now, but when we get to paper number 2, we're going to talk more about family photographs, how we look at them, how we understand them. That's the reason when I put the notes up for the Mike Rose essay, I also had included that picture of his mom, Rosie Rose, because we're going to talk more about photographs like this in the second assignment that we'll get to once you turn in paper number 1. And we'll talk about that, next week when we get to that assignment. But for now, as I mentioned, I'd like you to be working on your essays. Please go through the other videos. Please read through the directions. Send me an email if you have any questions as you're working on it. I'll post another video this week with some other suggestions for structure and some reminders of what this paper should look like. But read the Dwayne Johnson piece. I think you'll enjoy it. It's very well written. It's funny. It has his same charm and humor that we see in him when he's on the big screen, but it also develops and builds on some of the themes that we saw in Mike Rose and in Toni Morrison. So I hope that you'll find this also inspiring as you're trying to find this model to use as you're writing your own paper. So enjoy this. Please send me an email. In the next couple of days, I'll post another video talking a little bit more about the structure and just giving you some reminders and pointers as you finish up this paper. Okay, so I'll talk to you later. Bye.